I originally gave this paper at the Southern Historical Association conference in Baltimore a few months ago, and I got some really great feedback there, and I look forward to maybe talking with you guys about the content at the end, and we'll do some Q&A if you like. So I'm going to lead off with a short story. In March of 1822, Creek Depredations Claims Commissioner James P. Preston reflected on the violence that had occurred between Creeks and Georgians in the 1780s. Writing to Secretary of War John C. Calhoun from his office in Athens, go Dogs, Preston observed that between the years 1786 and 1790, the period under consideration undoubtedly was one of great suffering and privation to the border settler on the frontier adjoining the white settlements. The Creeks, whose frequent eruptions into those settlements were marked by an uncommon degree of ferocity. Georgians broadly shared and often repeated Preston's assessment of Creek relations in the 1780s. By contrast, Creek leader Alexander McGillivray insisted in 1786 that violence had been minimal. Very few Georgians had been killed. And he wrote that those fell victim to their own temerity. Yet this affair has been held forth by Georgians as the most violent, unprovoked outrage that was ever committed. By 1789, Secretary of War Henry Knox reported that the state of Georgia is engaged in a serious war with the Creeks. Indeed, matters grew increasingly grave over the ensuing decades, until Georgia settler Thomas Wilder despaired in 1812, "If we don't get some assistance, we shall have to move off of this frontier, or our families will be killed and scalped by the Indians. We are too weak to stand in our own defense." Now, I understand from Leslie Thomas that you guys are particularly interested in sort of the sources that underlay some of this history, so I want to talk just briefly about the sources that I used to write this paper. Now, as many of you know, a series of treaties signed between 1790 and 1825 allowed white Georgians to claim compensation for the kind of Muskogee raids that Thomas Wilder feared so deeply. However, a systematic analysis of thousands of these depredations claims held by the Georgia Department of Archives and History over in, is it Morrow? It's not Morrow, it's Jonesboro.
Morrow.
Is it Morrow? Okay. So a systematic analysis of thousands of these claims at the GDAH reveal that Creek raiders in the 1780s were far more interested in depriving white settlers of their property than in depriving them of their scalps. However, Georgians adopted sort of an exaggerated rhetoric that really overstated the level of Creek violence. And they did it, I argue, to justify disproportionate violence of their own against Muskogee people, and to justify large land taking. Now, what Georgians portrayed as unprovoked savagery along the frontier might be better described from the Muskogee perspective as a system of border patrol, in which Creek warriors harassed encroaching settlers by stealing horses and African American slaves. Georgians' rhetoric of Indian savagery and their assumption of eventual ownership of all Creek lands precluded any acknowledgement of Muskogee rights to defend their borders. Where some Muskogees saw a robust border patrol, Georgians saw a general war with all Creeks. Now, Only rarely did these border patrols end in violence, despite exaggerations of the uncommon degree of ferocity. Yet Thomas Wilder's declaration that he would soon have to move off of the frontier would have been music to the ears of Creek border patrols. Depredations claims and reporting from the Georgia Gazette attest to the dissonance between settlers' fears and the real dearth of violence in the Oconee Valley. So, what are we really talking about here in terms of the scale of violence? I'm going to throw some numbers out just so we can get our heads around the scale. Statewide, Creeks led almost 500 raids on white settlements between 1783 and 1790. Yet less than 50 of those 500 raids resulted in bloodshed. And fewer than 100 people were killed out of a total non-Indian population of 83,000. However, those depredations claims record at the Georgia Archives, those depredations claims records do confirm a kernel of truth in Commissioner James P. Preston's words. The years from 1786 to 1790 did in fact witness an uptick in Creek raids. And I'll give you some examples. Greene County in the upper Oconee River Valley was the most active zone of conflict in those years. But even in Greene County, only a dozen of more than 160 raids ended in bloodshed. And even that can overstate the matter. Greene County was home to 5,400 non-Indians. During the 5 most violent years of the 1780s, in Georgia's most violent frontier county, with a population well over 5,000 non-Indians, Creek raiders killed only 11 people. Now, the paucity of reporting on Muskogee violence in the Georgia Gazette demonstrates a lack of concern with Creek raids in the early 1780s. The Treaty of Augusta established the Oconee River as the boundary between Creek country and Georgia in November of 1783. Now, of course, as you might imagine, many Creek leaders objected to this new border. Yet, between 1783 and 1786, the Georgia Gazette reported not one single incident of violence. By contrast, the Gazette published several proclamations from Georgia leaders forbidding white settlers from crossing the Oconee border illegally and settling in Creek country. And those proclamations taken together seem to suggest that this particular kind of crime was pretty common. If they had to repeat themselves, it meant that nobody was listening. Now, if we sort of recalibrate our perspective, it looks like the period between 1783 and 1786 was marked by an uncommon degree of restraint on the part of Creeks, rather than an uncommon degree of ferocity. Now, one might expect violence to increase between the November 1785 Treaty of Galphinton and the 1786 Treaty of Shoulderbone Creek. Now, by way of reminder, the Treaty of Galphinton did 3 things. It confirmed the Oconee River as the border between Creek country and Georgia. It secured an additional land cession further south on, somebody help me with this pronunciation, Altamaha? Is that how people from there say it?
Yeah.
I've heard it said like 3 different ways. Altamaha, Altamaha. So it's on the last syllable? Altamaha?
I've always heard it Altamaha.
Altamaha.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, second thing that the Treaty of Galphinton does, it gains an additional land cession on the Altamaha. And the third thing it does is that it acknowledged Creek rights to arrest Georgians trespassing in Creek country. Yet, during the following year, the Georgia Gazette reported only 2 instances of actual bloodshed. The exaggerated rhetoric that appeared in the Gazette, however, reached epic proportions. One report stated flatly that there was little or no room for doubt of a war taking place immediately. In a letter to the publisher, one Chatham County man insisted that a Creek invasion of Savannah was imminent. He excoriated his fellow citizens for their failure to raise a common guard. He feared that at any moment, direct quote here, "Our houses will be set on fire, our wives and daughters violated, and our children dashed to pieces before us. All alike will fall victims to their never satiated appetite for blood." But, in reality, a significant increase in Creek border patrols occurred only after the November 1786 Treaty of Shoulderbone Creek. Now, like its predecessors, the Treaty of Shoulderbone Creek set the border between Georgia and Creek country at the Oconee. And it was ratified over the objections of some Creek leaders. The Georgia Gazette's reporting on frontier violence also increased after Shoulderbone. Yet, surprisingly, the stories in the Gazette, they celebrate white Georgians' violence against Creeks, rather than the other way around. For example, in September 1787, the Gazette reported that a group of Georgians trespassing in Creek country came upon a band of Muskogees. And again, direct quote, 9 of the savages were killed.